begin by saying it's really good to be here. I actually feel a bit geriatric looking at you, so I'm sorry about this. But it really is good to be here. And what I want to do is to talk a bit about how theology empowers worship, but also how worship empowers theology. I want to tell you my own story, how I got interested in this, and then start to try and make some connections that I hope you'll find both useful and interesting. I've lost my accent completely, but I grew up in Northern Ireland. And yes, that's right, it is there. While I was there, I was an atheist. In fact, I was a very aggressive atheist. I was absolutely convinced that anybody who believed in God was some kind of intellectual fruitcake. I was very, very aggressive in my atheism. In fact, when I read Richard Dawkins' writings, I get all nostalgic because, that's the way I used to be. And then I went up to Oxford to study science, and while I was there, really I was confronted by the reality of God, the truth claims of Christianity, and that changed everything. And in many ways, you can point to a moment in your life where everything begins to change. And for me, back in 1971, which was a long time ago, things radically changed for me. I'm a theologian, and by that I mean someone who is saying, let's try to capture the full richness of the Christian faith. Let's try and make sure we understand it for all it's worth. And the wonderful thing about Christianity is that it has so many dimensions. It's relational. It's about this wonderful, life-changing encounter with the living God. It's about the emotions. It's about realizing that we are loved and that we can love back. It's all about the imagination, expanding our vision of what reality is like and discovering our place in a bigger map of things. But it's also about trying to make sense of things, making sure we've really understood our faith and that there's a good, deep grounding for everything that we stand for. And in many ways, theology is trying to give us a map of our faith. If you go to a strange country or London, you will benefit from a map. London's wonderful, providing you know your way around it. But a map is a way of trying to represent what's there. It's no substitute for going and visiting London or Paris or whatever, but it helps you make more sense of what is there. And that's the point I want to emphasize, because Christianity is about this life-changing relationship with a living and loving God. But it's also about trying to make sense of the way of looking at things that the Christian faith makes possible. And one of the themes I want to emphasize today is that catching a vision of the wonderful richness of the Christian faith is going to empower your worship. So let me give you a quote from my favorite theologian, who is C.S. Lewis. And this is from an essay he wrote many years ago called, "Is Theology Poetry?" Now, the answer he gives to that question is basically, it all depends what you mean by theology, and it all depends what you mean by poetry. But it's the last line of the essay I want to quote this afternoon. I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not just because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. And what Lewis is doing there is saying, look, Christianity gives us this big picture. It's like standing on a mountaintop and looking down and seeing the woods, the landscape, the rivers, everything there, and appreciating how wonderful it is. Theology is trying to give us this bird's eye view, which helps us understand not just who we are and why we matter, but how wonderful, compelling, and exciting this vision of reality that Christianity makes possible actually is. And in many ways, worship is the natural response to this wonderful God. Theology is trying to expand your vision of God, your vision of all that God has done for you, your vision of who Jesus Christ is. It's saying to you, you know a lot, but there's more to know, more to discover, more to appreciate, and hence all the more reasons for worshiping. So think of theology as being about expanding your vision, your appreciation of this wonderful God and Savior. Why is this so important? Let's look at a biblical passage. Let's look at Isaiah chapter 6. Many of you will have read this. It's very well known. This is about Isaiah reflecting on his experience in the temple. It's after King Uzziah dies, and Isaiah says, I saw the Lord in the temple. And as he describes God, you get a sense of the gloriousness, the radiance, the majesty of this God. And Isaiah is completely overwhelmed. And he says, woe to me, I'm a man of unclean lips. He realizes he's sinful. This vision of a holy and majestic God begins by making him realize how small and sinful he is. Then that's dealt with. And then Isaiah hears God saying, who shall we send? And because Isaiah is empowered by this vision of a wonderful and glorious God, he says, here am I, send me. And that's what I want to try and say to you this afternoon, that theology expands your vision of the majesty, the wonder, the glory of God. And it makes you realize how sinful we are. We want to deal with that, but then it makes us want to go out and serve him. What I want to say to you is that worship is really that response to that vision of that wonderful, glorious, and radiant God. And that's why theologians talk a lot about the Trinity. And when I say that, kind of a shivers will go down your spines. When I was growing up in Northern Ireland, one of my more vivid childhood memories was going to a country church on a Sunday where there were a lot of farmers. And we said, this was back in the late 1950s, something called the Athanasian Creed, which I hope you don't say very often anymore, because it is rather dull. But there's one bit goes like this. The Father incomprehensible, the Son incomprehensible, the Holy Ghost incomprehensible. And the farmer next to me said in a very loud voice, the whole damn thing's incomprehensible. And I sometimes think that, that's the way people feel about the Trinity. It's kind of a very bad celestial mathematics. But what I want to say to you is just think about what's going on here. What we are trying to do is to do justice to God as God actually is. And in many ways, the doctrine of the Trinity is trying to open our eyes to everything that God is, making sure that we tell the full story, not just part of the story, making sure we realize and appreciate every aspect of this wonderful God. And so the doctrine of the Trinity begins to say to us, look, we begin with a God who created us, who created each of us and we matter, who made this world we see around us. And every time we see the starry sky at night or a beautiful sunset, we are seeing the glory of this God who we know and love reflected in that creation. Now, on its own, that is wonderful. But the doctrine of the Trinity is saying there is more to God than that. Because it goes on to tell the story of Jesus of Nazareth. It says, look, in Jesus, we realize that we have not just a good religious teacher, not just a prophet, not just a healer, but God himself entering into this world because each of us matters so much to him. It's about a God who comes to where we are, who enters into our history as one of us because each of us here this afternoon matters so much to him. And we begin to realize there's more that needs to be said. This is about a God who loves, who acts. Not just a God who says, I love you, but a God who comes to us where we are in order to tell us that. And as we contemplate Christ dying on the cross, we are reminded of just how much that God loves us. There was a commercial on television a couple of years back, and some of you may have seen it. It begins with a train hurtling through the night. And on this train, there's a man, and he's dressed in black. And as the train slows down to go over a bridge, he gets out of his seat, he throws open the train door and jumps onto the bridge over the river, climbs down the bridge, he swims the river, there's a cliff on the other side, he climbs the cliff, at the top of the cliff there's a castle, he scales the castle walls, goes through a window into a bedroom where there is a bed, and on the bed he places a box of Cadbury's milk tray. And the punchline is all because the lady loves milk tray. Now, it's a nice ad, but here's what I want to say to you. You think of Christ being betrayed, being brought before Pilate, being tortured, being humiliated, being forced to carry his own cross, being humiliated as he was nailed to it, and finally dying slowly and painfully. Now, that is all because God loves people like you and me and wants us to come back to him. And that's more of that vision of God. But there's more to tell, because we're not just talking about a God who made everything and who wondrously redeemed each of us. We're dealing with a God who is with us right now, who is empowering us and guiding us by the work of his Spirit. This gives energy, direction to our lives. It excites us. It makes us want to praise God. And that's part of the picture as well. And really what the doctrine of the Trinity is saying is, look, don't reduce God to something you can understand. Don't domesticate God. God is bigger than we can ever hope to tell. And that's why we worship him. I think it's very important just to realize that the doctrine of the Trinity is not some sort of abstract thing. It's really saying, look, this is the way God is. And when we realize the immensity and the glory of this God, we want, first of all, to get down on our knees and pray, but then to rise to our feet and worship. The greater, the better your vision of God, the more exciting, the more authentic your worship is going to be. And you're not inventing this idea of God. It's just the God who we know and love as we find him in Scripture, and above all as we see him in the face of Jesus Christ. So theology in many ways is trying to help you expand your vision of God. It's saying this is the way God really is, and asking us to respond accordingly. And in many ways, that's why I think worship is so important. Worship is a very good corrective to bad theology. When theology sees itself simply as ideas about God, ideas are dull. There's something missing. Worship is about reminding us that there is a living reality called God, and that our best response to him is in praise and adoration. And that challenges and corrects bad theology. But I want to suggest to you that maybe theology can also help think about worship. Because sometimes we wonder if worship is really about, trying to whip up the emotions a bit. In other words, it's all about trying to make us feel about God in certain ways. What I want to say to you is, once you catch a vision of the way God really is, you don't need this whipping up stuff. It just comes naturally. And so one of the points I'm going to make this afternoon, I think it's a very important point, is that theology is simply laying things out and saying, this is the way things are. Isn't this God wonderful? And inviting you to express that in worship. Now, I talked about the Trinity, and I could talk about many other areas of theology, but let's just look at one. Let's think about what we might do in relation to thinking about the meaning of the cross of Christ. We're talking about an area that we sometimes call theories of the atonement, but you don't need to use that phrase at all. What we're trying to do really is take in the full richness of what the cross is all about. One of the illustrations I sometimes use when talking to students is to say, look, think of a beam of white light going through a prism. What happens? At the other end, it's broken up into the colors of the rainbow. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. And the point I'm making is, look, all those colors were originally there in the beam of white light. They're not being invented. They're just being separated out so you can see them individually and appreciate them. And in many ways, that's what we do when we do theology about the meaning of the cross of Christ. We try to tease out each of the individual elements so we can appreciate each of them in its own right. Let me mention some of them. Number one, the cross and resurrection of Christ are all about victory over death, Satan, and evil. It's a great theme in 1 Corinthians 15. And you can see how significant that is. It's all about giving hope. Socrates may have taught us how to die with dignity, but Christ allows us to die with hope. It changes everything. And you can see how that great theme of victory could become a major theme of your worship songs. It's all part and parcel of what the death and resurrection of Christ is all about. But there's more to it than that, because the cross of Christ is also about the demonstration of the love of God. Think, for example, of John 3. God so loved the world, he gave his only Son, so that we might have eternal life. And this seems to me to be something really each of us needs to take in and then express in the joy of worship. That each of us here this afternoon, for reasons we don't fully understand, matter to God profoundly. That each of us here this afternoon is special in God's sight. That each of us here this afternoon is being called to do something special and wonderful for this God. That is life-changing. And again, that aspect of the cross is something we need to celebrate and proclaim in our worship. And there's more to it than that, because the cross is also about healing. It's about restoration. It's about binding the wounded. It's about making people whole all over again, putting people's lives back together. And again, you can see how much you could say about that. And of course, it's also about forgiveness. Real forgiveness of real sin, which changes life utterly. And you know, you could use your worship songs to do some theological teaching. You think of John Wesley back in the 18th century, who realized that songs were not just ways of celebrating what God had done, but also helping people to grasp this, to understand this, to take it home with them, to sing these songs at home and soak in the reality of all that God is and all that God has done for them. So it seems to me there is much that you could do, not simply in letting theology excite and inform your worship, but also in thinking about using your worship as a way of communicating some theology. Now, worship songs very often are about a celebration of our personal devotion. It's about stating our love for God. And so very often they take the form of, I love you, God, I care for you so much. And there's nothing wrong with that at all. But maybe we could also think about trying to put into these songs the reasons why we love God so much, the reasons why God is so immense and significant, the reason why we feel called by Him to worship Him in this way. So what I'm trying to say to you is that theology is about going deeper. It doesn't in any way try to deflate the excitement of faith. It's not in any way about trying to minimize the importance of each of our relationships with God. It's simply saying there is more to it than this. We can go deeper. And in many ways, theology is about going deeper. It's like going to an island, and you see this wonderful island, you fall in love with it, and it's very exciting, you sing its praises. But you begin to realize it's a big island, and there are only a few bits of it that you've discovered. You like what you see, but you realize there's more to discover. And in many ways, theology is about exploring your faith. And I want to reassure you that this is not going to damage your faith. This is about going deeper. This is about enriching what you already have. It's not in any way going to challenge the importance of your relationship with the loving and living God. It's not in any way going to make you love God any less. It's just about appreciating even more how wonderful that God is. It's a bit like falling in love with someone. You know that you love them, and then you begin to discover more about them. You discover what a complex and rich person they are. Theology is an invitation to discover more about who this God is and what this faith we have embraced has to say to us. I want to say to you that this is something that I think is really significant, and it's something that each of you can go. Go deeper, because there is much for you to appreciate, and my personal hope is that this would bring a deeper understanding of your faith, which will enrich your worship. Now, I've talked briefly about two areas of theology. I've talked about the doctrine of the Trinity. I've talked a bit about the whole idea of atonement. Let's look at one more area. Let's look at the doctrine of grace. Grace is this astonishing idea that even though each of us is sinful, each of us is weak, each of us is inadequate, and many of us know those things very, very well indeed, that we are dealing with a gracious God who is able to take and use us as we are. It's not what you are that matters. It's what you allow God to do in you and through you. And that little word grace, if you like, opens up this whole aspect of God's character, which is that we are talking about a God who empowers despite our weakness, a God who is able to use us despite the fact that we are weak, and a God who wants to envision each of us with a sense of who he is and what he would like each of us to do. And in many ways, one of the great themes of this doctrine of grace is one I'd like all of you to take away with you this afternoon. It's this, that even though we may feel we're not really very good or not really very special, that each of us is special in God's eyes. And that maybe there is something special he wants each of us to do, which maybe nobody else can do. And wherever God gives a task, God also gives the gifts we need in order to do this. You think of that great commission at the end of Matthew 28, where you have the risen Christ speaking to his disciples, urging them, commanding them to make disciples of all nations. Go and make disciples of all nations is the command. But you all know it's followed immediately by a promise. Lo, I am with you even to the end of time. Because grace is all about us not being on our own. It's about being encouraged, accompanied, and excited by this loving and living God who has bestowed and outpoured his Spirit so that we are able to rise to the challenges we see around us. Or again, you might think of Paul on his missionary journeys in 2 Corinthians 12, where he's aware there is so much to do and he experiences this thorn in the flesh. What's that all about? It's all about Paul having to discover something that each of us needs to know, that God is able to use us even in our weakness. And Paul hears these words spoken to him, and I think they're spoken to every one of us this afternoon. My grace is sufficient for you. My strength is made perfect in weakness. And I want that to excite you because it's a principle that really helps our worship. You may feel that your words, that your music aren't good enough to do justice to this wonderful God. But God is able to take those words and that music and do something special with them. Worship is not simply a human activity because God's part of this. God is there not just as the one we are worshiping, but as the one who helps us to worship him properly. So that seems to me to be something really important to take away. That this great vision of God not only helps us to worship him, but brings home to us how even though we are imperfect and might feel we're not really up to writing worship songs, nevertheless, God's in the game. God is helping us to praise him. God is the one who guides us as we try to worship him as he should be. And that again, I think, shows how that way of thinking helps us to give our best to God and really get excited as a result. So am I saying you should all be theologians? Well, what I'm really saying is that actually we're all probably theologians without knowing it, because we think about our faith. We want to join up the dotted lines. We want to be able to see the bigger picture that emerges from our faith. I think one of the things that I often reflect on are those words of Jesus when he's talking about the great commandment. You should love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. And what I'm saying to you is that each aspect of our being relates to God in a slightly different way. And each of those matter. And I think that worship really speaks so powerfully to our imagination, to our emotions. It gives us a vision of who this God is and why God's so important. But there's also a discipleship of the mind in which we try to set down these deeper roots. It's not about contradicting anything, it's about supplementing it. It's simply adding something on to the riches you already have. And in many ways, I'm simply saying this is something that will bring added depth and vitality to your faith. Now, theology does matter. It matters because people challenge us about our faith. All of you know about the new atheism, writers like Richard Dawkins or Christopher Hitchens arguing that faith is fundamentally irrational rubbish. And there are very good answers we can give. But one of the points I'd like to make is simply that we need to know the answers to these questions. It's about giving added depth to our faith. It's about being able to witness to these things more effectively. And therefore, I'd like to say to you and to all who you speak to that we really do need to resource people to be able to ask the question, answer the questions that people in our culture are asking. Because we need to be able to reach out and answer those questions that people are asking. But I want, as I begin to bring this lecture to an end, to focus on the importance of worship. Why is worship so important? I've mentioned some reasons already, but let me tell you about some people who I've met who have come to faith because of worship. Let me tell you what they told me. They said, I was brought to this service by my friends, and there was this period of worship, and I felt quite overwhelmed by it. And I began to realize that these people around me had discovered something that I just didn't know at all. And whatever it was something that was clearly enormously significant and important for them. And I said, I've got to find out what this is. In other words, worship was a gateway to faith for these people. And I want you to know that worship is indeed about encouraging and exciting the people of God. But it's also about reminding others around us that maybe we have found something that they have not, that we have discovered something that brings us to a place where we want to worship and adore this living God. A theologian called Augustine of Hippo, back in the year 420, wrote these words: communities gather around their objects of adoration. And the point that he was making is that worship helps bind the Christian community together. About 3 years ago, I gave a talk to a group of atheists about Christianity, and it was quite interesting. I think we had a very interesting discussion. And afterwards, we got talking, and I explained to them on Sunday I'd be taking some services and preaching, and I asked them what they would be doing on Sunday. And they said, well, 3 or 4 of us are going to get together and we're going to watch a video of Richard Dawkins. And I have to say to you, the thought that went through my mind was, how sad. You know, you can imagine these people with their cups of teas and sandwiches around the TV watching Richard Dawkins, where you are gathered worshiping, exulting in the presence of the living God. And I want to say to you something which I hope is blatantly obvious to you, and that is that trumps anything. Worship is about exulting that you and I are enabled by God's grace to enter His presence and be excited at drawing close to Him. What you are doing as worship leaders is binding the people of God together, is reminding them of the vision of God which so excites us, which impelled Isaiah to mission and will impel others to mission as well. There's a sense in which worship is the heartbeat of the church, and you will enable people to recharge their spiritual batteries so they can go out into the world and bear witness to God, having been reaffirmed in their faith by your worship. And that seems to me to be really important. I'm sure others will have said this to you, but you worship leaders really matter to the mission of the church, because you are the ones who, in effect, remind us of who God is. Because if we come to church on Sundays and don't feel like worshiping God, it's not God that's at fault. It's that we've lost that sense of excitement. Worship challenges us. It invites us to rediscover something we must never lose, and that is that sheer sense of amazement that this God welcomes us and loves us. And somehow saying, thank you very much, doesn't actually seem good enough. But worship is rather better. Worship is our thank you to God for all that He has done, which also re-energizes, re-envisions, and reinvigorates us to serve God in the world. My final point is this. I mentioned the doctrine of grace, and I will mention it again. It's all about realizing that even though we are human, even though we are weak humans, even though we're sinful humans, God is still able to use each of us powerfully. Faith is about saying yes to this God. I'm going to end with an incident from the Old Testament. It's about Joshua leading Israel into the promised land. Moses is dead. The challenge of leading the people of God into the promised land is there, and it's been handed to Joshua, who feels completely inadequate to the task. And God speaks these words to Joshua, and I think He speaks them to all of us as well. And these are words of presence. They're words of power, and they're words of promise. Have I not commanded you? There's Joshua 1:9. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and of good courage, and do not be afraid, because I, the Lord your God, am with you wherever you go. And in your words and in your music, you can reassure the people of God that wherever they go, whatever situations they face, they do that in the presence, with the promise, and in the power of that living God. You have so much to give the churches, and I just pray God would richly bless each of you, and that through you, He would richly bless all the rest of us. Thank you so much for listening. we've deliberately left some time for questions. We have some roving microphones. These people are very keen to be kept very fit. So if you'd like to ask a question, somebody's going to run to you and we'll try and answer as many questions as we can in the next 10 or 15 minutes. Who would like to begin? We would very much like there to be some questions. We have one here. Okay, we're ready.
My daughter wants to study theology, and quite a few people have said to her, we're worried that you will lose your faith if you go down that route. Now, I'd like her to study with you, but that might not be possible. But why does this happen, and is it something to be aware of?
I'm sure there's good worship and bad worship. And there's good theology and bad theology. And bad theology very often is just about kicking ideas around and trying to evaluate them in the light of a very rationalist worldview. That's not good theology. Theology is really about discovering the intellectual vibrancy of the Christian faith, its own distinct vision of rationality, the great theologians who've expressed this, and how they can enrich us today. I think the problem is that there's still a lot of theologians around who live in a previous generation and haven't really reconnected. For me, theology is at its best and at its most authentic when it connects with the life of the church, when it relates to the faith of individuals, and above all, when it leads to worship, to prayer, and to evangelism. And I think what I'm going to say to you is, there may well be very defective visions of theology around, and your daughter may be unfortunate enough to come across these. I'm sorry about that, but there are better visions elsewhere. She needs to look and be critical. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
We're having difficulty seeing hands. It's because the lights are so dazzling.
Hi there, at the top here. Hi there. With so much of the book of Psalms being based around lament, what role do you feel that has to play in our congregational worship?
There's no doubt that the Psalms frequently have this theme of lamentation. God hasn't done some of the things we'd like him to. We haven't done some of the things we feel we ought to have done for God. And in many ways, the whole theme of lamentation in the Psalms is in effect, C.S. Lewis makes this point in Reflection on the Psalms, is in effect simply being very honest. It's saying, look, God is great, but we've let him down a bit. Maybe we need to reflect on this and try and ask what's gone wrong. And in many ways in the Old Testament, lamentation is a prelude to restoration. It's about engaging with what's gone wrong as a prelude to try and setting it right. And obviously, I'm not a worship songwriter, but I can see ways in which you could use sort of a psalm of lamentation as a way of, in effect, laying out, look, we know we should have done this, we haven't. We know we should have thought this, we haven't. But by recognizing something has gone wrong, we can begin to try and put things right. So I think what you could do is see the theme of lamentation not as a sort of theme that is complete in itself, but rather as something that is the gateway into restoration and renewal. So that seems to me to be a pathway that could be quite interesting to explore. Thank you for that. Lots of questions down here.
You talk about us leading people into the presence of God, and many people here will be looking for practical things. Sorry, right here.
Well,
Center and right on the ground floor. Hello.
Well,
I wonder if you could maybe just say in a practical sense how you could help people lead them deeper into theology.
I think the best advice I can give practically to worship leaders is please don't listen to me about worship, because I'm just rubbish at this stuff. So in many ways, in terms of practical help, see what I've been saying today not as practical help, but as giving you a kind of framework or way of seeing things that's going to let you begin to do things in a new way. I'm not a practical person in the sense of, I don't really know very much about how you write songs or anything like that. But I do know of the overwhelming power of the Christian faith. And what I'm trying to say really is discover that and see if that energizes your writing.
So that's what I meant. I meant this from the theological perspective, which you know much about, not the worship.
I think from a practical perspective, what I'm really saying is don't hold back because you feel you're not very good. Don't, in effect, feel that you are unskilled because you aren't as good as you think you could. I mean, one of the real issues here is this doctrine of grace is all about God taking people and actually transcending their limitations. God's actually quite good at doing that. And in many ways, I'm just saying, let's exult in that and see where it takes us. Thank you.
My question has to do with the scriptures that says God is a spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. In layman terms, what do you think that means?
I think that the quote you've given, which is from John chapter 4, is very much about the interaction between the Samaritan woman and Christ on what is essential to pure worship. And the context of that discussion is very much about, look, I'm a Samaritan woman. We have this tradition of worshiping God. We are a distinct ethnic group. And as a result of this, we feel sort of way disadvantaged in relation to others. And I think in many ways, the whole business about worshiping in spirit and in truth is about being able to transcend our limitations. It's not about us as individual human beings with distinct histories that somehow inhibit us from praising God as he really is, but realizing that the truth of the gospel and the empowerment of the Spirit actually transcend our limitations. So I think it's actually a very important point to make. In terms of how that affects us today, I think there are two things I would say. Number one, I firmly believe that all worship is grounded in the truth of the gospel. But I think it would be good for congregations if some worship songs expressed that truth of the gospel, simply because it's a good way of educating congregations. And secondly, the reminder that worship comes from the Spirit. In other words, it's not really us saying, let's try very hard to worship God, because there's nothing really about God that makes us want to worship him. It's about, in effect, realizing that worship is the reaction we have when we appreciate God for all that he is. And in many ways, the Spirit is the one who opens our eyes, who heals our blindness, so we can see God as he really is. And that's why I think prayer before worship songs is so important, in order that we can all have our eyes opened to the greater glory of God, both by God himself, but also in a secondary way through the worship, which helps us to focus down on him. Thank you.
Hi, just when you were talking about the different aspects of the cross and like a prism and picking out the different things, it just reminded me and someone else in our group of the massive disagreements that just evangelicals have in the kind of notion of an orthodox view of the cross, and what parts of that form a proper part of those prism threads, especially I'm thinking of obviously penal substitution and things like that. But there are so many other disagreements amongst our kind of evangelical world, and also thinking of things like the Rob Bell sort of controversy recently. I guess I wondered if you had any thoughts on how we as worship leaders can deal with things that evangelicals massively disagree on, and should we aim for to avoid subjects like that in our worship songs, or how can we deal with them in a sensitive way that doesn't cause kind of conflict?
Well, we can't avoid talking about the cross in our worship songs, so I think we focus down on it. Though I think the best answer I can give you is that the four themes I gave you are actually all they all just jump out at you from the New Testament. And in many ways, where evangelicals disagree with each other is how they interpret and weave together those different elements in the New Testament. And I think for me, the best answer I can give to your question is that sometimes it's best to bypass the theologians and go straight to the New Testament. You know, look at some of Paul's phrases, some of the gospel phrases, and see those as in effect giving us a very powerful vision of what this is all about. You don't need to bring in the technical language of theories of the atonement, and indeed, those are secondary to the New Testament itself. I think that in many ways, worship does its job best if it helps us go back to the New Testament and, rediscover through reading it the dynamism and energy of the gospel proclamation. I mean, for example, if you just think about the New Testament on the cross, I mean, it does emphasize the love of God, the forgiveness of sins. It doesn't talk all that much about mechanisms. It talks about reality. And I think the great thing about worship is it's constantly reminding us of the reality of what God has done for us. We can think about the theories later. I think worship is about reaffirming the reality and helping us all to appreciate how this changes everything. Thank you. We have time for one more. I'm very happy to see where we go next. Our last question this afternoon. I think we have a question. Do we have a question down here? We seem to have lots of hands up and a relative shortage of microphones, so we'll just have to see what happens. I think I may take two last questions, this question here and this question here, okay? So here we go. 2 microphones, 2 questions. First question.
Thank you very much. Yes, what I wanted to ask is you've spoken a lot about worship being the response to our understanding of God and what we see of God and our experience of Him from a theological perspective. And indeed, we can find that when we learn something new, we're just filled with a sense of response and worship. However, one thing that I think we tend to do is whenever we get together, we start with worship. And we then, in a sense, are responding to worship itself. Can you comment on that?
Well, I think that is always going to be a danger. There's always a danger that worship becomes an end in itself, that worship is seen almost as a technique which we have to get right. And I think, I'm not for one moment saying that we shouldn't practice, we shouldn't try to give our best in terms of musical performance and so on. But actually, what distinguishes worship from a performance is the presence of God. And in many ways, worship is about us giving our best and God then being part of that and actually making it something really very special indeed, which is why worship needs to be bathed in prayer. I have nothing against, making sure we do our best in how we perform, but that's the human side of things. Worship is really when God gets involved and is able to take what we offer and make it something even more. So I think you're right, there's a danger this becomes something we pursue as an end in itself, but really it's a means by which God is able to bless and enrich the congregation. Thank you. This is our last question coming up.
So you said very clearly when there's nothing wrong with worshiping to give God our thanks, and basically it was to use I language. I love you, God. I worship you, God. I have a number of friends, evangelicals from a Latin American context, who take deep issue with Western worship songs and their focus on I, and prefer primarily, almost exclusively, to use language of we, or to make that focus entirely God. God, you are. Could you speak a little bit more when you said that about kind of the theological thought you have behind what that mix should be, and how it helps correct or adjust our own theologies?
I think many people in Latin America, also parts of Africa, would say that many people in Western culture are very individualist. In other words, they're simply thinking about themselves and God, and everybody and everything else gets blanked out. And I concede that's a risk. And certainly when they're saying we should say we love God, what they're saying is the whole community comes together. I take that point. But saying I love God is a very good starting point. The problem is if it becomes a stopping point as well. Because, worship is really saying, let me begin by sorting myself out. Worship is, in effect, me challenging myself as to whether I love God as I should. Once I've got that sorted out, we can begin to move outwards. And I think that in many ways, worship is a very important way of just challenging each of us as to whether we really have discovered all that there is about God. Now, there is nothing wrong at all with worship songs which are about we. As a community, this is what we believe, this is what we've discovered about God. I have no difficulty with that at all. I think the real issue is whether we focus on ourselves as individuals or ourselves as a community, that worship doesn't become an end in itself, but becomes a means to empowerment, to service, to outreach, to evangelism. And that seems to me to be the really important point, but I do take the point your colleagues are making. And there we must end. Let me thank you for some wonderful questions. We could have gone a long time, but you have a very busy day, and it's been a huge privilege to be able to speak to you today. Thank you very much.